watched that clip several times on my laptop in preparing for the sermon this morning. But it's like super gnarly and gruesome on the big screen, especially the part where he's like biting into the fish. Like for some reason that just really got to me. But it's good because that's kind of the impact I'm hoping that this clip will have on you. I normally attend the 9 o'clock service, and so it's really nice to be here at 11. I see some familiar faces, some new faces, but again, it's just really nice to share this space and honor God with you this morning. So let's talk a little bit about this clip. For those of us who are Lord of the Rings fans, which I'm really hoping is everyone here, or I'm not sure I can keep going with the sermon, this is a famous scene, okay? We see this decline of Smeagol into Gollum. And so if we had looked a little bit earlier, like the scene right before this one, we would see Smeagol, a hobbit, with his friend Deagle. And they are in a boat, they're fishing, they're celebrating Smeagol's birthday, they're like in the Shire's great outdoors. It's a really idyllic scene, okay? It's like an example of the abundant life. But what happens is that as soon as the ring enters the picture, everything goes downhill. All of a sudden, Smeagol has this desire, this lust, okay, for this ring. And the ring symbolizes many things, one of which is like power, wealth, control. And again, as soon as that takes over, that greed, it sends him on a downhill trajectory. He ends up killing his friend Deagle that he's out fishing with on the boat, okay? Ruins his entire birthday, is basically cast out of the Shire, and then ends up in this like shallowy, terrible, dark abyss that we just saw. The more that Gollum desires this ring, okay, the more that he desires that power and that wealth, the more inhuman he becomes. He goes from hobbit to this creature called Gollum. And what I'm hoping that we're going to see this morning is that this is what greed does to all of us. When we are so consumed by greed, especially greed for wealth, we like de-evolve as humans, okay? We are taken away from the abundant life, and we all turn into Gollums. So there's a gentleman named Augustine. He was a really tremendous Christian theologian in the 5th century, and he says the following. He says that the irony is that by lusting after something more, one is actually made less. And I think Tolkien, in like his like crazy imaginative genius, captures Augustine's sentiment really, really well. I think when Smeagol first gets the ring, it's like, oh, this is my ticket to paradise, right? I'm gonna be rich, wealthy, I'm gonna rule the world. Elf town, hobbit town, whatever, I'm gonna rule it all, okay? But what ends up happening is that that very desire, again, does not lead to richness of life. It leads to total poverty of life. Okay, we see that in this transition of Smeagol to Gollum. The more obsessed he becomes, the less human he becomes. I don't know if Tolkien had 1 Timothy chapter 6 in mind when he created Gollum's character, but it nicely represents what Paul is trying to teach Timothy and the church and us today. So we're going to jump into 1 Timothy chapter 6. I do think, hopefully, it will appear up on the screen in just a moment. If not, feel free to pull out your Bibles or your phones, your iWatch or Apple Watch. So again, we're going to be looking at 1 Timothy chapter 6 this morning. We're going to be going through verses 2 through 10 and then 17 through 19. If you have any questions about like the verses we're not going over, feel free to ask me at the end of service. All right, so I'm going to start reading in verse 2, and we're going to look at what Paul is trying to teach this church in Ephesus. So this is what Paul has to say to Timothy. He says, "Teach and urge these duties. Whoever teaches otherwise and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ and the teaching that is in accordance with godliness is conceited, understanding nothing, and has a morbid craving for controversy and for disputes about words. From those come envy, dissension, slander, base suspicions, and wrangling among those who are depraved in mind and bereft of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means of gain." So basically what's happening is we have these false teachers that are in the church, that are in the community that Paul is writing to. And their false teaching or their false doctrine is really corrupting the church, okay? And Paul is not happy with this. And so he basically paints a wanted poster, okay? You'll know you're a false teacher because of these things that I've just listed. And Paul mentions that one of the worst accusations against these false teachers is that they're actually selling the gospel, okay? They're so greedy for money and wealth that they're selling Jesus' message and making a profit off of it. And they consider that gain. Paul is not happy about that, and he spends the next several verses trying to correct that really, really faulty view and understanding, and really confronting the church about this idea of greed and how it causes us to do really terrible things. So verse 6, of course there is great gain in godliness combined with contentment. For we brought nothing into the world so that we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with these. But those who want to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and in their eagerness to be rich, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. Paul spends these verses trying to help the church see and understand wealth from a godly perspective. He's just said that the way the false teachers are pursuing wealth, this intense greed, is not appropriate. And the only way out of that greed is to actually pursue contentment. But in order to pursue contentment, we cannot let society tell us or have society shape our beliefs. We have to have God's perspective on wealth in order to be content. Otherwise, we will never be content if we look at society and try and seek contentment. Paul basically warns those, if you really are going to be greedy and you really do want to pursue wealth and you really do want to become like these false teachers, this is what's going to happen to you. And it's like this chain effect, okay? This greed creates this chain reaction within people. The first is that those who want to be rich fall into temptation. Okay, they're enticed by something and they fall into it. That's the first step. The next step is that they're actually trapped by this. In the Greek, it literally means a noose. And so this initial temptation, this enticement, now becomes a source of total destruction and death. And then lastly, Paul says, they're plunged into ruin and destruction. They literally drown, okay, in ruin and destruction. And what's interesting about this particular verse, or this particular word that Paul uses for ruin, is that it actually means perdition. And so what Paul is saying, he's not saying that you lose your salvation in any way. But what he is saying is that the way we understand and pursue wealth in the present does have eternal consequences for us. And then again, Paul summarizes kind of what he said with this statement that we have all heard 100 times, right? For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. We hear this all the time. I don't think we take it seriously enough, because if what Paul has just said is that our unholy desire for wealth, right, our greedy desire for wealth can lead us and have tremendous consequences in eternity, then we need to take that seriously in the here and now, and we need to root out that greedy desire for wealth. Because if we don't, this is what happens. Those who have a greedy desire for wealth, right, those who desire to be rich, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. They have literally left the faith, okay, because of their greedy desire for wealth. They've walked away. This is a pretty bleak picture, but then Paul, again, has a way out of this. And we see that in verses 17 through 19. Paul tells the church directly, especially those who are rich in the church. He recognizes that there is economic disparity, right? There is rich and there is poor. And Paul is saying, especially for those who are rich, okay? Don't be haughty, don't be proud. Don't be prideful about the wealth you have, because pride leads to self-reliance versus reliance on God. And next, you may be rich in this world, right? You may have so many material things, and yet if you really genuinely want to be rich, this is what you need to do. You need to be rich in good works, generous and ready to share, and thus storing up for yourselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of life that is life. For Paul, the way out of a greedy desire for wealth is to pursue generosity. That is the answer. That is the antidote. If you want to avoid falling into temptation, entrapment, and being plunged into outer darkness, kind of like Gollum was, right? You need to pursue generosity. That's the only way out. Because what happens is that as we pursue generosity, we become more and more content with what we actually have. And the reverse is also true. This is what's cool about what's happening in this chapter. Paul is saying pursue contentment and pursue generosity. But it's almost like a correlation, right? The more content we are with what we have, the more willing we are to let things go, okay? They don't have a hold on us. And so we can be generous. And then the more generous we are when we actually give to those who are in need and give stuff away, the more content we are with a simple life. And so again, for Paul, that is what it means to take hold of life that is really life. So what does this mean for us today? Okay, this is Paul in the first century talking to his protege Timothy in the church in Ephesus, but what does this mean for us in the 21st century? Truthfully, I think it's a one-for-one correlation. I think it's a direct application. So when we look at our current society, well, first, we are like one of the top 7 wealthiest nations in the world. And when we look at our society, wealth is everywhere, and our obsession with wealth is everywhere. It's like dripping. It like saturates our culture, okay? And so to give you a little bit of an idea about this, we see wealth and greed embodied in people like, there we go, Floyd Mayweather, okay? He's a sports icon. I had no idea who he was, but apparently they call him Money Mayweather because he's so rich. And so he made $275 million off of his fight with Conor McGregor in 2017, like one fight alone, okay? So Floyd Mayweather, we see it embodied in social media personalities like Kylie Jenner. As of this month, she's worth $1 billion, okay? And she's most famous for Kardashians, and then she started her own cosmetic line. She's kind of all over the place right now. U2, all right, I love U2. I went to their concert in college, but yeah, they made $315 million off of their Joshua Tree tour. They did like a 30th anniversary commemorative tour in 2017, and they just piled in the cash. And then this is Lil Wayne. I don't know how many of us are familiar. He has diamond teeth. So if we are putting diamonds on our teeth, I don't think I need to say anymore, okay? This is a tremendous display of wealth, as well as our greedy pursuit and obsession with wealth. So again, we see this everywhere in society, right? And truly, I think if someone were to like come and like interview us on the street and be like, oh, would you like to have Floyd Mayweather's money? I think all of us would probably say, oh, absolutely. I would totally take that cash, okay? I don't think any of us would be like, no, I kind of like living in my 2-bedroom house. I like my, 2006 Honda Civic. I would totally trade my life in for this, guys. So again, this idea that we are all consumed by wealth. We see it in shows like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? We see it in the lottery. Okay, we see it in these get-rich-quick schemes. Okay, I don't know what this guy is getting paid to listen to, but like this is a legit ad, and so he's getting money for something. But again, this is everywhere over our society. And the very fact that it's out there, marketers and scammers totally know the inclination of our heart, right? That it's greed, that this desire for wealth. It plagues all of us. But what we also see in society is the total downfall of wealth, okay? The outcome of greed and the outcome that wealth and pursuing it greedily can have on us. So first up, Lindsay Lohan. I think we're all familiar with her. Struggles with substance abuse. I'm not sure if she's clean or not. Next up is Amy Winehouse. She passed away from alcohol poisoning. She was a tremendous British singer, but again, lived a life of addiction because of the wealth that the traps, right, she fell into. Harvey Weinstein, we've heard about him a ton in the last year. 2, and then Anthony Weiner, okay, sex scandals. I know these are like extreme examples, okay? But what Paul is saying to the church in Ephesus and us today is that we run the risk of becoming like these people and ultimately of becoming like Gollum. If our desire for wealth so consumes us, okay, we are at risk of not taking hold of life that really is life. I think we all struggle with an unholy desire for wealth, if we're honest with ourselves. We all want more. That's just part of being human. And I think this looks different for everyone. And I think sometimes we can think this is an unholy desire for wealth. But when I look at my own life, I think some of the things, again, or how I desire wealth in an unholy way, that maybe you can resonate with is, saving, right? Obsessively working even to save money, to build up our savings accounts and our 401ks for retirement. Or it might look like investing in these get-rich-quick schemes, okay, in order to get money fast for either a new car, a down payment on a house. It might look like checking the stock market 10 times a day to see what's happening with our money and having that anxiety, right? When it's up, it's up, and when it's down, and having our entire existence and our entire day shaped by what the stock market's doing. And maybe it even looks like charging interest on money that we give to friends and family who are in need. The list goes on, okay? Our unholy desire for wealth manifests in many different ways, but again, the end result that Paul is telling us is that we're at risk of becoming Gollums. I don't know if you caught this in the clip earlier, but Gollum and his raspy, weird, throaty voice, this is what he says. He says, "It cursed us. It drove us away. We wept. We were so alone. We forgot the sound of trees, the softness of the wind. We even forgot our own name." Gollum's little monologue really summarizes what Paul is teaching the church in 1 Timothy in the church today, here at Valley Friends. Paul tells us that a gluttonous pursuit of wealth actually leads to ruin rather than riches. It leads to poverty of life rather than taking hold of life that is really life. And that is really what Paul wants for us. That's what he wants for the church in 1 Timothy, is to take hold of life that is really life. But ending up like Gollum is not life that is really life. Ending up like these false teachers is not life that is really life. And so what do we do if we want to take hold of life that is really life? The message is the same to us today. Pursue contentment and pursue generosity. And there's a correlation between both of those. The more we strive to be content, and there is no formula, right? There is no, this is exactly how you do it. A plus B equals C. It looks different for all of us because of where we're at in life. But pursue contentment. And again, the flip side of that is pursue generosity. And being generous, again, is going to look different for all of us. But Paul is specifically saying to the church in 1 Timothy, you do good deeds, you give, you share what you have with those in the church. And so it might look like, I'm going to buy groceries for someone this week because they're struggling to afford it. Or I'm going to pay their electric bill, actually, because they're at risk of getting it cut off. Or I have the funds to pay for their health insurance premium for the month. That's what Paul is saying, is that your generosity needs to be played out practically in the church. And in doing that, in practically displaying, right, your care of neighbor, you're storing up for eternity. He's saying that what we do in the here and now very much relates to what is going to happen in the hereafter. So as I was prepping for this sermon, I was actually prepping for a class I'm going to be teaching in the fall, and it's called Discipleship and Ethics. And I took this class when I was in seminary forever ago, and I was remembering that the professor always had us write a letter every week to either a friend or a family member or a coworker, someone that we could really share with how we were wrestling with the content of the class. And so again, we were charged with writing a letter every week. And I thought to myself, that was a long time ago. I really want to find this letter. And I thought, well, I'm type A, and I know for sure that I filed that letter array somewhere, and I did. I found it, okay? So I wrote this 10 years ago, and when I was rereading it, I was struck by a couple of things. One was that this was really my first, I would say, experience wrestling with this idea of how much wealth had a grip on my heart and how much God was really trying to change that. It also was a reminder of God's tremendous grace to me, but also a reminder of how far I still have to go in letting, being released, if you will, from the grip and greed of desiring money. Okay, so I'm gonna read this letter to you. I wrote it to my friend Jen, so it starts off, Dear Jen, Philip Yancey says that whatever my lifestyle level, I desire freedom from money's spiritual bondage. Then perhaps I could more purely seek guidance on how my money should best be used. I too desire this freedom. In my Christian walk, I've greatly struggled with the issue of money. What job should I choose? What's an appropriate salary? Should I even have a salary? Should I have a savings account? How much should I have in my savings account? Should I own any property? Should I invest in the stock market, start an IRA for my future? What's an acceptable tithe? How much should I give away? Who should I give to? All of these should-Is are stifling. My almost obsessive questioning perhaps is a testament to the power money still has over me. Ironically, a majority of the rest of the world never has to struggle with these questions. Many of these questions are the product of the incredibly wealthy nation we inhabit. When we have so much disposable income, we want a formulaic system by which to save, invest, and make more money. Ironically, for many other nations, the concept of disposable income doesn't exist, for disposable implies excess. However, perhaps all of my questions are actually a testament to God's grace in my life. God's grace being the only antidote that can stand against the deadly power of money. These questions are the byproduct of a spiritual struggle between God and wealth for my heart. Only by asking and struggling with these questions and with God's intervention will I hopefully arrive at a place of contentment and understanding. I'd much rather spend my life struggling than turn a blind eye, live in ignorance, and submit to money's power. In thinking about this issue, I'm reminded of two things. The first is when I was struggling to pay tuition and rent my senior year of college, and you generously gave me enough to cover it without expectation of return. I was new in my faith and had no idea what you were doing. I just remember crying hysterically and immediately saying that I would totally pay you back, to which you said, "Don't be crazy." I was so amazed and confused by your generous spirit. That level of generosity didn't make sense to me. I didn't realize then that your generosity was a pouring out of your faith. It was your way of showing me just how radical Jesus' message was. The second thing is the summer I spent in Cairo serving Sudanese refugees. There were many heartbreaking and soul-angering moments, but one in particular stands out. After working at the children's school for several weeks, I learned of a student who'd recently been hit by a taxi driver and whose leg was subsequently broken. One of the teachers was raising money for the student's medical bills, which consisted of a routine surgery and a casting of the leg. The bills totaled about $1,000, a somewhat minor sum in American dollars, but a fortune to the impoverished Sudanese. My team had brought little money to the trip, but upon learning that the Sudanese didn't have enough money to cover the medical expenses for this little boy, I immediately sought out my team, earnestly conveyed the story, asked for prayer and the finances we'd brought with us. My team decided to give, and it was almost everything we'd brought for the trip. In reflecting on that experience, I don't think I would have been prompted to give to this international member of God's family unless you had first shown me what generosity was when you gave me money to cover tuition and rent. We were totally poor college students, at least according to American standards, but we were the wealthiest people in the world to the Sudanese. To my knowledge, this was my first intentional step against wealth and towards generosity. What I mean by this is I wouldn't consider myself a naturally generous person, especially in a context where I just graduated college and had no job lined up. From a worldly perspective, it looked foolish to spend whatever money I had on this Sudanese boy, and yet from God's perspective, that was the only wise thing to do. That was 5 years ago, and since then, I've thought to live a life worthy of what I feel like God has called me to. Simple, low income, giving when I can. Honestly, though, I still want more money. Money to travel with, pay for my current education, and money to secure my future. Even after moments like the one in Cairo and others along the way, my heart is still a battleground between God and wealth. Yet I've experienced the blessings and freedom that come with it. I pray that whatever my lifestyle, I'd be content in little and much, and that I'd continue to receive God's grace and perspective in the midst of my struggle. Thank you, my friend, for listening and for showing me what true generosity is. Love, Jess. So I wrote that 10 years ago, and yet I can still see my own struggle present day in this letter 10 years ago. God's values are always going to clash with our world values, our society's values. Paul knew it, and we know it today. We feel it. The tension is there, and the tension is okay. But what Paul is telling us is that the only way out of the grip of wealth, right, the noose that wealth can create for us, is to pursue generosity. Paul is very much concerned about care of other, care of neighbor. We see Jesus' message in that way come out, right? Love thy neighbor. But I almost think the deeper message for Paul is that, yeah, but the benefit is actually for you. I want you to take care of your neighbor, but in order to fully release yourself of the greed that consumes us, you got to give. You got to let go. You got to release that wealth. And in that, just like the curses of greed multiply and multiply, look at Gollum, right? It's this just solid decline, down, down, down. He's just continuously cursed, cursed, cursed. The same happens when we're generous. The blessings multiply for others and for ourselves. I'm going to close with some song lyrics. These are written by a woman named Audrey Assad, and she's been around for a while. I just kind of encountered her, I would say, a couple months ago. And she writes this song called I Shall Not Want. And I really encourage you to go listen to it after this service if you can. Maybe we could get it playing back there. But this is my prayer for us this morning and my encouragement as we leave here. From the love of my own comfort, from the fear of having nothing, from a life of worldly passions, deliver me, O God. Amen.